Today, Canada concluded its campaign for a seat on the UN Security Council. The result may not be the one we had hoped for, but we are proud of the campaign we conducted over the last 4 years. I want to thank all of the countries who supported Canada in its bid to the Security Council. I also want to take this opportunity to congratulate our two competitors, Norway and Ireland, for their election to the Security Council of the United Nations. I also want to take this opportunity to congratulate Mexico and India for their election to the Security Council. For Canada, this campaign allowed us to renew and strengthen many of our bilateral relationships. Over the last 4 years, we made countless connections at all levels and cemented friendships that will last for years to come.
Canada has lost officially its bid for a seat at the Security Council, one of two non-permanent seats. Norway and Ireland both won in the first round, 130 votes for Norway, as you can see on the screen there, 120 votes for Ireland. I want to bring in very quickly for reaction former Premier of Quebec and a special envoy for Canada to help them win this seat, Jean Charest. Mr. Charest joins us now, I'm assuming from Montreal. Hello, nice to see you, sir.
Actually, I'm in the eastern townships of Quebec, Beth.
My mistake. I apologize. My mistake. Thank you for your patience, and I really appreciate you making the time for us today, Mr. Charest. I have to start off with a simple question. What's your reaction to the loss?
I'm disappointed, and I think the government's disappointed. There were high hopes for this campaign. Even though Canada, Vashi, came into the campaign late, the two other countries, Norway and Ireland, who are, by the way, both very good candidates for the Security Council, had been at it for 10 years, and Mr. Trudeau, after his election, decided to try for this position on the Security Council, but was late, way behind the two others. And yet, Canada waged a very good campaign, an honorable campaign, and I think we'll come out of this with a lot learned. And this was an opportunity for Canada to renew its relations with 190 countries plus on a bilateral level. So we've learned a lot. We've come out of it. Mr. Trudeau, I think, was right to do it. He did a great job in campaigning in difficult circumstances. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Champagne, was superb. So was our ambassador in New York, Marc-André Blanchard. So this is a tough outcome, but an honorable outcome for Canada.
I understand all of what you laid out, and I think a lot of efforts went in on the diplomatic side, and understandably so. I think at the same time, critics of the government will say, the Prime Minister promised Canada was back. And, Liberals were very critical of the Harper government for losing a seat back in 2010. What does it say today that they themselves could not secure that seat?
Well, Canada did not lose the seat for wrong reasons. I mean, if we lost the seat, I think it's mostly because we came into the race too late. And I know about that because I talked to some number of leaders, and a number of countries had already made a commitment. And they stuck to their word. They said, before you were a candidate, we had made a commitment to Ireland and to Norway, and we are just going to respect our word. Had there been a second round, which almost happened because Ireland came in at 128 votes flat, flush, which is exactly what they needed to get in, I think Canada would have been in a good position, but that did not happen. That being said, we learned a lot from the race. I mean, we learned a lot about where we are in the world, how we're perceived, what we need to do, where we need to be. And we need to take, we can't let the benefit of that whole effort be wasted. We should use it to review our foreign policy, look at where we are, and build on that.
Based on your conversations, your role as a special envoy, on that exact point that you just made, what would you take from this outcome as far as our foreign policy, our efforts on the world stage? What needs to most specifically be addressed and improved?
One of the things that has to change, Vashi, is that we have to be more present in certain parts of the world than we have been in the past. Africa, the Middle East stand out. Now, the African continent is 54 countries. It's rising in a lot of ways. It has, of course, extraordinary challenges, very young population. But Canada has not been as present and active as it could have been. And I'm not faulting anyone for that. I think we have to take good note of that. The same is true in the Middle East, where we have to be more present. Now, that being said, Canada at this point in time has a lot to offer on the issue of multilateralism as a mid-sized country that's part of the G7, the G20, the Francophonie. I mean, we are in a lot of forums where we have a voice that we can use to rally a lot of countries that are like-minded, to be able to shape the world in a way that also serves our interest. It isn't simply polarized by the superpowers.
How much is our ability lessened today to do that by this outcome?
We had a very honorable outcome. We ran a very good race. We had a lot to offer. There's, one thing that stuck out in my mind and what we were saying to the other countries is that we believe that the UN has to deal with the issue of economic security, which would be new because it's tied to everything else, and even private sector being involved in that. And that was, I think, new and something that we should pursue. And we should just come out of this having learned a lot. We're keeping our head very high. The department, the folks who are in the public service who led this campaign were exceptional. Now let's pick ourselves up, take what we've learned from all of this and move ahead and play the role that we should be playing in the world, which is much more prominent and a stronger presence in areas where they need us and where we need them.
I want to ask you about that role because, one, as I was listening to all the discussion, especially in the last few weeks leading up to this vote, a number of people who are focused on foreign policy made the observation that at least facing the public, I'm sure the discussions might have been different where you're concerned or in your circles, but at least facing the public, it seemed like the push was for Canada to have a stronger voice in the type of institution and series of institutions that it truly believes in. So we believe in multilateralism. The U.S. has regressed from its role. We should be part of that system. But there wasn't exactly a clear indication given of what we plan to do there once we're there. So rather than just the ends being what we're trying for, what is the end rather than just the means to an end? What is the goal? Do you think that that's a fair criticism? Was Canada not articulating exactly what it planned to do with an increased voice?
Well, the criticism you expect, and yes, it's a comment that I think the government paid attention to. What we wanted to do, and I'm going to return to the issue of economic security, I thought was very interesting, fairly simple, fairly straightforward. What it said to the rest of the world is we believe governments and the private sector, by the way, should be involved in building up the capacity of our economies and infrastructure and other things, and that this UN Security Council should also be paying attention to that if we want to live in a world that offers economic and all other forms of security. So that, from my perspective, was a very constructive view of what we could accomplish together. It remains true today as it was before. And so Canada should continue on that path. We should be the one voicing that. And in multilateral institutions, we need to establish new rules and we need to make it work. And the Americans have signed off on the World Trade Organization, and the conflict and trade conflict between China and the United States polarizes everyone. Right. We're collateral damage in that. And we need to pull out of that and be in a place with other like-minded countries who think there's more to this world than just being dictated to or having rules set by the superpowers, that we have a voice.
Mr. Charest, I appreciate your time and your insights as always. I do also want to get some analysis and reaction to this decision, to this vote. And to do that, let me bring in Stephen Lewis. He was Canada's ambassador to the UN from 1984 to 1988. He's now the co-chair of the Stephen Lewis Foundation and joins us from Toronto. We're also joined by Lloyd, who was, of course, the Foreign Affairs Minister when Canada last served on the Council 2 decades ago. He's now chair of the World Refugee Council, and he joins us from Winnipeg. Hello to both of you, gentlemen. Thank you for making time for us, and I apologize for the delay. Thanks for your patience.
Thanks, Vashi.
Thanks, Vashi.
Mr. Axworthy, why don't I start with you? Very simply, are you surprised by the outcome today, and what is your reaction to the loss?
I am a little surprised. I actually thought that we had a very good chance of doing it. So I think Marc-André Blanchard was putting in an awful lot of effort. But, we are up against some serious odds, and I think the foreign minister expressed some of those, that the other two countries have been in the game much longer. I think that we still carry some sort of baggage from things that have happened in the past, where we had basically withdrawn from Africa and reduced our ODAs and simply weren't much of an international player. And that doesn't change overnight. You have to be very carefully building up networks, and you actually have to get some accomplishments. I mean, I think when we ran in 99, 2000, we were in an era where there was a lot more openness. There was a lot more sense that we're going to change the world order. We could do more innovative, reformed things. We're now in an issue where you've got the three major powers of the Security Council who play schoolyard bully tactics and aren't interested in anything that can be considered to be constructive or innovative or reform-minded. And I think finally, this is where Vassie, I disagree with your power panel in many respects. I think it is a real disappointment for a lot of Canadians. I'm not saying it's going to be a huge wave of majority vote, but there's a lot of Canadians who take real sort of pride in the fact that Canada stands for certain things and can implement certain things. It's not just the rhetoric, it's the action. And I think that for young people in particular, if we'd won this seat, it would have given a real sense of movement, of difference, that we had made a change. There are a lot of Canadians who come from other countries as refugees, as immigrants, who are here as second generation. They want a country that has a voice to be heard. So I think that there has been some drawbacks, but it's not over. You get back, and you cry a while, and you get back and go back to work.
And no problem with disagreeing with other panelists. We like to highlight different opinions on this show. Mr. Lewis, I wanted to get your perspective as well. First, were you surprised? Second, on the point around action. The last time you were on this program, you highlighted that, for example, when it does come to the portion of GNI that Canada is spending on foreign aid, it hasn't changed from the previous government. It's not increased to the level that that others aspire to. Do you think that had an impact?
Yes, I do. And in terms of the result, Vashi, I must admit that I was surprised. I actually thought that Marc-André Blanchard was an ambassador of such unusual standing that he could carry us over the finish line. And I was surprised that that didn't happen. But I also thought that the foreign minister demonstrated either a remarkable capacity for self-delusion or extraordinary naivete in thinking that Canada isn't carefully measured by other countries when we're running for something like the Security Council. So you keep on repeating how important we are and how committed to multilateralism we are. But in terms of the point you raised, Vashi, it was Lester Pearson, of all things, of course, who set the target of 0.7% or 0.7% of GNP for official development assistance back in 1970. And we are even now 1/3 of that target. So that when governments around the world, particularly in the developing world, in Africa, are measuring our capacity to be these people of financial acumen, they see nothing but hypocrisy. When we talk about peacekeeping, which was another Lester Pearson initiative, we've opted out almost entirely, and the world knows that. When we talk about climate change, it doesn't miss the world. Many countries that we made a lot of sonorous rhetorical promises in Paris and then came back to Canada and bought a pipeline. These inconsistencies sit large in the international community. No one will have missed the fact that we've begun to sell arms again to Saudi Arabia. One shouldn't be naive about this. We are measured carefully. And unless the government understands that it has no foreign policy at the moment that is credible, we're simply not going to have the international standing. We always talk about our convening power. That's just not enough.
Mr. Axworthy, what do you think about that statement?
Well, I think I agree with much of it. When you talk about being measurement, it's as much by what you do, not what you say. I think that it's easy to use the words, and I think that maybe this should be a little bit of a landmark to say we have to get sort of back into the game and actually become not so much a convener, but an initiator, a supporter, a donor, a contributor, particularly because there's such a vacuum now with the withdrawal of the United States from any form of international commitments, the kind of bullying that's going on from China and Russia. I mean, the United Nations is in deep, deep trouble. The Security Council has become paralyzed. And that's why I was really deeply hoping that Canada would have a seat, because I think it could provide an antidote to those kinds of attitudes. But if in response to Stephen, I think it's the old issue. Let's learn from the lessons, not look at the spilt milk. And that's where I think that it's up to the government now to be much more active in encouraging and involving Canadians, parliamentarians, interest groups in how to redefine where we want to go. It's not a matter of having kind of an inside baseball view. You have to, and this is where I think the role of Parliament becomes very, very important, encouraging the members of Parliament of all parties in the Senate to become actively engaged. And one of the things that I learned about when I was back in Foreign Affairs is that you hold major meetings in the country to get people to talk about the UN and human rights and international courts and things of that kind. And I think that there hasn't been that kind of dialogue or debate or discussion. It's been really very much a kind of inside the canalway discussion about the role that we play.
Mr. Lewis, when you, I saw you nodding there at the end. I'm wondering if we're looking forward now. If the government is to take something out of this, what should it be, and how should they demonstrate that?
Well, the world, as Lloyd said, and he's entirely right about this, the world is desperate for leadership, but it can't be leadership, Vashi, of rhetorical generalities and abstractions. It has to be concrete. There have to be real initiatives, whether it's on coming out of COVID-19 or whether it is rebuilding an entire global health apparatus, or whether it's criticizing the Security Council for having the permanent five, which is completely out of date and means we can never discuss anything, whether it's Syria or Yemen or Myanmar or Burundi. None of the major hotspots in the world can be addressed because of the paralysis at the Security Council. You never heard any of that from Canada. You didn't get a sense of concrete positions. And unless those positions now emerge, we're always going to be on the periphery. We have this mystique, Vashi. It's so interesting. There is about Canada a feeling that we're a progressive middle power that cares about issues and that is a decent country. But that seems no longer to be sufficient. We have to have some policies. And ironically, the policies are just not there. All that exists is a series of abstractions. It's just not good enough.
Well, you've both given us a lot to think about, and I appreciate your insights and expertise very much. Thanks for sharing your time, and thanks again for your patience throughout the evening.
Thank you, Vashi.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye,
Stephen Lewis, he was Canada's ambassador
again,
to the
Stephen.
UN from 1984 to 1988. And of course, Lloyd Axworthy was Foreign Affairs Minister when Canada actually last served on the Council 2 decades ago. To recap what we were discussing, Canada has lost its bid for one of 2 non-permanent seats on the UN's Security Council. That news broke not long ago. We've heard from the Foreign Affairs Minister from New York City, Phillipe-Champagne, who acknowledged the loss, standing next to Canada's ambassador to the UN, Marc-André Blanchard, but promised to plod on with Canada's efforts to reconnect with the rest of the world. I want to bring in now Dennis Horak for more analysis on the news. He's the former Canadian ambassador to Saudi Arabia, as well as the former head of mission to Iran, and he's in Toronto. We're waiting another guest to join us as well. Mr. Horak, thanks for being with us, and I'll bring Ben Rosewell in as soon as we get him. I wanted to start off with you. Were you surprised, Mr. Horak, at the news that Canada lost this bid?
Yes and no. I was hopeful that we would win, but we started this very late, and I think we were always it was a bit of an uphill battle from the very beginning. So I'm not overly surprised, no.
Mr. Charest, Jean Charest, who was an envoy, special envoy to Canada's efforts to secure this seat, identified Africa and the Middle East as 2 areas where he thought Canada lost some points, let's say, with members who were voting. You obviously have a ton of experience in the Middle East. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I mean, it's entirely possible. There's a number of reasons why countries vote for country X or country Y. Bilateral relations is clearly an element, and while we have good relations with a number of countries in the Middle East and Africa, we have problems with others. So that's only one issue, though. I think it's our position on regional issues that factor in. Personal relationships also between the ambassadors in New York, because some of these ambassadors, frankly, vote any way they want because these are secret ballots, and sometimes the personal relationship between the heads of mission makes a difference. Additionally, vote swaps are obviously important. The fact that we came to it very late, while Ireland and Norway would have had vote swaps in place, I think it made it more difficult for us. And then there's the various initiatives, whether it's initiatives in Africa or whatever, that do play a role. I think it's probably less so than we try and pretend. So there's so many different factors. And some of our relationship with Saudi Arabia, for example, I don't think the Saudis are in a position now that they could have scuttled our position with the Middle East by themselves, but whether they were talking us down or not might not have helped.
Okay, I want to bring in Ben Rosewell because I do believe that we have now successfully connected to him. He's a former Canadian ambassador to Venezuela, now the president of the Canadian International Council. Mr. Rosewell, can you hear me okay?
Yep, loud and clear.
Excellent, great. How big of a deal is this loss from your perspective?
It's a big deal. I think it shows that we've run into a dead end in our foreign policy. And maybe it's a dead end that we needed to run into to force us to contemplate the scale of the change that we need. The Security Council was seen as the apogee of Pearsonian diplomacy in that golden age when Canada's foreign policy was entirely about shaping the institutions and the alliances that govern the rules-based international order. That's how we could play a larger role than a middle power normally would be accorded. Maybe today is the message that we take away from today is that it's time to bury Pearsonian diplomacy. Those institutions, those alliances, they just don't carry the same weight. That's not really where the game of international relations is played today. Now we're dealing with...
Sorry, I apologize for interrupting. I just want to, you really grabbed me kind of what you're saying there, because that's kind of the opposite of what the Prime Minister's been saying, right? For the past number of weeks, it's the focus on the importance of multilateralism that he has really drilled home in his comments. And you're kind of saying that may not be the case.
We're now in a world of power politics. The great powers are no longer acting with any kind of regard for the rules established by bodies like the Security Council. The rules-based international order is probably a thing of the past. So the game that we need to learn to play now is power politics. Now, we could have played that at the Security Council because that is a table where the great powers sit. But maybe this will be the kick in the pants that we need as a country to learn how to play power politics, that we're not focused exclusively on these institutions created in the 1940s. Yes, we do need to play ball with other countries. We do need a degree of international cooperation. We do need multilateralism, but we need to start with our allies, look at where our common interests are, build power with them, and then that might require new institutions and new alliances to project our interests and to protect our values in a world that's totally different from the one when Lester Pearson was around. So I think it might be time to bury Pearsonian diplomacy.
Do you think that's true, Mr. Horak?
Well, I think certainly the international system is going through a very difficult transition right now, and I think that's most acutely reflected in the relationships and the attitudes of the permanent 5 members of Security Council. You've got a China which is much more assertive, Russia that's disruptive, the U.S. that's disinterested, the U.K. is distracted, and France is at sea trying to deal with these other 4. And so it is going to reflect different changes in the Security Council, how it operates, how it doesn't operate. I think it would have been a very frustrating time, and it's going to be a very frustrating time going forward for the Security Council. And there may be new institutions, but I think Ben's absolutely right. We have to, we should try and support multilateralism as much as we can, whether that's working with like-mindeds or whomever, or the next U.S. administration, hopefully. But we also have to look at other ways of dealing with this, sort of alliances of convenience, if you will. I'm talking diplomatic alliances here. And just trying to figure out what our interests are, how we pursue them, how we can pursue them unilaterally, how we can pursue them with other allies. It's going to be a much trickier road ahead, and it's going to take some adaptability and certainly more flexibility that some of our old perceptions and old assumptions, I think, are going to have to absolutely be questioned, because the international system is going through this transition.
Let me ask you, Mr. Rosewell, how realistic you think that is, and I'll circle back to the original point I made to you. if anything, the message that I have heard from the federal government over the past number of months leading up to this vote is the significance of the institution, because, you know, there have been critics of the UN for a long time from various vantage points, but certainly that criticism isn't new. It's been accentuated by the U.S.'s withdrawal from multilateral institutions basically as a whole, but it's certainly not, you know, just come into existence. Given the degree to which this government has attached itself to the significance of these institutions, at least rhetorically, how difficult or how realistic do you think it might be for them to unwind that?
Oh, it's beyond rhetorical commitment. I mean, the rules-based international order is everything in Canadian foreign policy. It's the entire foundation on which our prosperity and our security has been based for 3 generations. So the prospect that it might be gone is terrifying, and it will take quite a long time for a government that for 3 successive governments and a whole diplomatic corps that built over generations with this as the centerpiece of our foreign policy. That's coming to the terms with the end of that is not something that happens overnight, but it's urgent that we do so. And hopefully the loss today shows us just how much more urgent that is. You know, they often say early on in your program that Canadians don't really care about foreign policy. They don't really notice. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think it might be that the current formulation of foreign policy doesn't seem to be resonating with Canadian citizens. It doesn't seem to have resonated with other member states of the UN. But we do have a tendency to frame our foreign policy in terms of opportunities, of all the great things that we could do out there in the world. The world's become a pretty terrifying place, and perhaps if we start framing our foreign policy in terms not of opportunities, but of the dangers that are out there and how we need to respond to that to protect the lives of Canadians and to protect our economy from the kind of devastation that we've seen over the last few months, I think we're going to see that kind of foreign policy message will resonate with Canadians.
Okay, I have to leave it at that point because I'm coming up against the end of my show, but I appreciate your time, both of you, very much, and your insights as well. Thanks a lot to Dennis Horak and Ben Rosewell. Thanks, gentlemen. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.